Rain bangs the city like a loose shutter. Street lamps blur into long orange smears, the sidewalk a slick mirror of headlights and neon. Terrence Coleman stands beneath a stop sign, shoulders hunched against a cheap jacket that has known better winters. His hands are the hands of someone who has lifted the living and the dead. Square, calloused fingertips, a faint scar across the left thumb from a night years ago when a patient slipped through his fingers. A woman sits on the curb, her shoulders wrapped in a way that says she has run out of armor. She cries small, even in the noise. No story, only the ache threaded through her breath. A taxi pulls up. Someone hurls a slur from inside, the kind of thing that lands like a stone. Terrence catches the edge of her coat with the same hand that once took pulses in hospital corridors, and he puts $2 bills into her palm because he can't do anything else. "Take it," he says, "get out of the rain." She stares at the money like it is part of a puzzle. Then, in the dim gray, she lifts a face that has been gilded in photographs the world will never see. For a second, Terrence thinks he recognizes the jaw, the slope of her cheek, as if from a newspaper column tucked away in his sister's folded pages. She says nothing. He steps back. The bus pulls away. The city swallows them both. He walks home slower than he needs to. The $2, somewhere between his fingers and her palm, becomes a small doctrine. Kindness given when you have nothing is the only honest kind. He fingers the keys, the cheap ring. Upstairs, Gladys is awake, the television muttering like a foreign country. The house smells like boiled cabbage, and the coffee he can't stomach anymore. His phone buzzes. Another collect call from a woman whose voice he knows by heart. Jazz, his sister, inmate number. Laughter hardened into rationed hope. He answers with the steady cadence of a man who has learned to be the calm. Outside the city, in a glass tower where the lights do not flicker and rain sounds like applause, the Ashfords move in measured steps. Eleanor Ashford is a woman whose face has been polished by voters' trust, and whose name settles into committee minutes with the same gravity as a law. Once a judge, now a patron of causes, she walks into ballrooms like a promise. When she stops, chandeliers lean in. When she smiles, the photograph fills a charity page. No one imagines her on a rain-slick curb. The next morning there are headlines. Celebrity gala tonight. Ashford family to honor medical foundation. A photograph of Eleanor's glove is beside a column about civic responsibility. Terrence reads the small print in an appeal packet for Jazz, the yellow legal folder on his kitchen table. The petition asks for a re-examination of the case, evidence that never saw daylight, and a line about a certain hospital committee that had been advised by a charity arm of Meridian Healthcare, the company whose vans hum past his neighborhood at odd hours. He thinks of the nights he worked as a paramedic, of doors that closed and did not reopen. He thinks of the man in the hospital bed who stopped breathing after a routine transfer. 3 nurses that evening said there was something wrong with the medication orders. He took notes, stubborn little marks on a work paper. He filed a complaint. He called supervisors. He watched the complaints go into a folder, into a drawer, into silence. His certification was revoked for procedural irregularities and for failure to follow chain of command. The hospital called the disciplinary board. The board called their counsel. The counsel made the phone call that put Terrence in a corner. He cleans floors now. He wipes coffee rings from boardrooms he'll never sit in. He listens to jazz records at low volume and thinks about the man on whom he held pulses. He sends the small amount he can to a P.O. box that holds Jazz's letters. He is careful about laughing. He keeps his pride in his chest because there is a person with dementia who needs his small, patient kindness. Gladys, who in the light will not always know him, and in the night will call him by the name of their father. His life is a ledger of small, necessary sacrifices. The bus stop moment borrows a calendar for its revenge. 6 months later, Terrence notices a flurry outside the Ashford Grand Hotel, a swirl of silk and cameras. He is mopping a back entrance for an event staffing company. The cathedral doors open, and a young woman stumbles out into a corridor of umbrellas, a trembling breath, mascara like a map of rushing tears. This is Grace Ashford. Grace, who was pictured at charity auctions. Grace, who studies art and smiles for the press. But tonight she runs like any frightened thing. She pushes through folding doors and into the back alley where Terrence's mop bucket wheels in a slow orbit. Her manicured heel slips. Terrence is the only person who ever pauses for anything that does not have an invitation list. He sees the rawness in her eyes. He hands her a paper cup from a staff cooler without thinking and hears, over the rumble of deliveries, the sentence that will grow teeth. They'll protect the family. She grins then, the kind of laugh that tries to get oxygen into closed lungs. She doesn't explain. She leaves a folded note in the cuff of his glove, $23 in crumpled bills, and a scribbled address of an outreach program she wants him to know about. The numbers mean nothing now. The look she gives him is what matters. The knowledge that within the skin of a family famed for its philanthropy, something corrosive is moving like steam. An ashtray of gossip begins to smolder. Terrence learns in pieces. He learns because small people with small deaths pay attention. A waitress called Naomi is hurt in an incident outside a staff entrance. An attack with hot oil splashed. Not a scene of macabre detail, but a deliberate attempt to silence. Naomi's hands are burned enough to keep her quiet about who she saw leaving the hotel that night. There are whispers. A crew of men hired for force, an older man in a gray coat, and the rumor that orders come from a place where cash moves through shell companies. The press prints the phrase, "Billionaire's wife scandal," in a sentence that tastes like fireworks and ash. Terrence hears the story piecemeal. He hears that Naomi was escorted from the hospital by a security van with a Meridian Healthcare logo. He hears that the hospital will not return calls. He files the pieces the way he used to file after a crash. Look at the spread, catalog everything, make the pattern visible. He hears the name Meridian more and more. Meridian was the hospital where he took notes. Meridian is the company that sponsors the Ashford Foundation. Meridian is the machine rumored to siphon money into shell companies and project the Ashfords as benefactors. The name stands there, gleaming, ironed, a corporate smile that never blinks. The inciting incident does not feel like a lightning bolt. It feels like a slow tightening. Terrence finds an envelope in a locker at the office, a USB drive tucked into a paper napkin. It has no label. When he whispers the question to the older night foreman, he is told to mind his own work. The drive looks like the toy of a teen hacker, but when he plugs it into an old laptop, the files bloom. Spreadsheets with coded company names, memos that instruct cronies to manage perceptions, a list of employees who suddenly resigned after hospital incidents. There is a name on the file header he recognizes, an account that routes funds to Avalon Trust. And Avalon Trust funds a private legal defense that paid for the testimony in Jazz's trial. The folder uses words like mitigate exposure and protect assets. His jaw tightens. It is too much. It is precisely enough. He is careful because he knows how the world treats a man who meddles with money and reputation. He copies what he can, puts the drive in his sock, and keeps it like a rosary. The next week, a man in a suit asks awkward questions about inventory. The week after that, there is a loud knock at the door that rattles Gladys's teacups. Terrence leaves the drive in a place he thinks no one will find, a secret behind the loose floorboard beneath the bread box. In the city, power is a burrow that sends out tendrils to entangle anyone in its shadow. The Ashfords are not monsters. They are a dynasty that has found the language of philanthropy and learned to say it in a way that shields consequence. Eleanor is the pivot, a woman who argued law with the same cold precision she uses to cut flowers for donor luncheons. She knows how to make inconvenient facts invisible. She also knows every phone number that can erase an incautious life. Terrence is not reckless. He is a man who has been reckless once in his life, with the truth, and paid for it. He is not going to be reckless again. But the files keep crawling into the corners of his days like an itch. He begins to make fragments of copies. He writes names into a small notebook that has the soft corners from being carried in a back pocket. He gives a photocopy to a friend at the kitchen, Raymond Torres, a man who will become a cellmate later, a man with a restless mouth and a reputation for telling the truth in the wrong rooms. Raymond reads the prints at the back table and smiles like a boy who has found a secret passage. "This is what they can't burn," he says. "This is what brings the house down." They talk about lawyers. Lawyers are expensive. Lawyers are political. The idea of a check, $15,000, comes like an invention. Who pays for someone like him to hire counsel? Terrence tells himself he will hold the files until he knows what to do. He is a janitor because he is not supposed to be dangerous. Then the frame slides into place. One morning, he is in a conference suite early, mopping the carpet at the Ashford Grand after a gala. He is careful, methodical. He sets the mop against the wall and answers the phone. Jazz's voice, a rambling story about the day in the yard that wreathes like a prayer. He laughs softly and forgets the room for a moment. A security guard appears, eyes narrow as if detection is a muscle he has practiced all his life. Someone from corporate comes through with a clipboard. The clerk at the desk looks troubled. The man with the clipboard asks for IT and inventory access, and when Terrence goes to fetch boxes in the lower supply closet, a hidden camera watches where he goes. The camera will later be included in a chain of evidence that looks very bad for him. A week later, before dawn, federal-looking agents arrive at his door. They knock, then break the silence with a polite and tired efficiency. He is cuffed in front of Gladys as she watches from her recliner with the blank stare dementia gives when the world shifts too quickly. The charge? Possession of stolen corporate property. Allegations of attempted corporate espionage. The phrasing is a surgeon's parry, precise enough to cut. The thing they claim to have found in his locker is a flash drive containing internal memos. Memos that were copied from the company server and that match the files he knew from the napkins days ago. It is theater arranged by people who practice theater every day. The press will later call it a leak on the front page, an unfortunate slip by a disgruntled ex-employee. Others will spin it into a narrative about the dangers of whistleblowing. Terrence knows the feeling of being seen as a problem rather than a person. The cuffs bite into his skin like a ward. The jail smells like bleach and old coffee and the slow smallness of people trying to sleep. Terrence sits in a sterile chair that fits nothing of him. He is booked on charges that feel both ridiculous and heavy, felony charges that will draw an archive of public suspicion. He is given a cell and a bed that has seen more than it should. He is careful here too, watching the lines of men's faces, measuring what their eyes reveal. Raymond Torres sits across from him in a common area with a bowl cut and a laugh that sounds like he is missing a tooth. "They'll frame anyone if they need a face on a headline," Raymond says, flipping through a phone with photos captured like evidence. "You and me, two black men in a story. Easy to make a narrative. They will tell the paper what they wanted to say." Terrence learns a lot in the hours where the microwave hums and plates are handed through grates. He learns that Meridian uses third-party contractors to staff security details. He learns that certain employees have been reassigned and their emails scrubbed. He learns from Raymond that in his last cell, a man named Paul had been transferred suddenly the week after he testified in a small malpractice suit. The pattern is there if one knows where to look. Make the witness fragile. Make those who see inconvenient things disappear into slow paperwork. In a visitation room, his mother Gladys grasps his hands with a softness that is both recognition and forgetfulness. She calls him Terrence like she used to before she called him son. He tells her he is fine because it is easier than telling her the truth. He hides the fear like a bruise behind the cup of coffee. The windows show a smear of the city rushing past. The media picks up the shape of a story and begins to chisel. Headlines that used to be glossy with Ashford-friendly features now offer angles. Worker arrested in leak slides into questions raised over Meridian ties. The billionaire's wife scandal phrase leaks into online headlines like oil. Eleanor's photo, a softened portrait for donors, filters into feeds beside a sentence about family crisis. Behind the curtains, a different machine is turning. Jennifer Walsh is a federal prosecutor with a reputation for not being impressed by the trappings of wealth. She was a prosecutor on healthcare fraud cases before she was courted by the department to take on corporate malfeasance that fuses charitable fronts and medical care. Jennifer has the patience of a woman who can read a sentence and see how it will turn into a ledger. She receives a tip about the hot oil incident and a list of names that track back to vendor invoices. A nurse who is afraid for her job emails her a photo with a shaky hand of a receipt that doesn't make sense. A whistleblower phone call comes through an anonymous line, detailing a pattern where patient outcomes were deprioritized in favor of cost savings and profit channels. Jennifer files it under open. She reads the reports about Terrence's arrest and does not close the file. She keeps it because she knows the pattern of who gets charged and who gets protected. She orders a routine inquiry into the procurement records associated with Meridian. The term revenge will later be written about her in a column as she prosecutes FBI agents' revenge, but she is not an agent of personal vengeance. She is a prosecutor who believes the arc of justice must be long and patient. Meanwhile, inside the Ashford house, the family sickness is not a single monster, but a chorus of complicity. Richard Ashford is a man who learned to see leverage as a language. He inhabits towers like a man who never learned to fear. His son Craig is less certain, forced to attend board meetings and golf outings and told to sign papers without reading the ink. Craig's conscience has a crack in it. He keeps small things in his desk like good people keep postcards from old friends. Craig's daughter Grace is the one who keeps tripping awake in the night because she sees things her family does not want recorded. Eleanor goes to the curb one night and does not want the world to see. She takes the walk because guilt makes errands smaller and less like a parade. She is the woman in the rain who took the $2. She remembers the gesture in a way that nestles itself under the skin of something she cannot control. The $2 become a key. She keeps them folded into a book for months. She cannot throw away the memory that a man with no platform gave her a sliver of humanity. When Terrence is charged, Eleanor's sleep becomes an indictment. Memory arranges itself into a new sentence. She sits at her vanity and sees the flash of Terrence's face as if it were a name on a docket. She calls no one at first. She calls no one because the weight of her own decisions is something she has worn the length of her career. One morning she sits in a kitchen with the curtains pulled and dials a number that has been saved under Jennifer Walsh, DOJ. She asks for a private conversation. She offers to meet somewhere neutral. This is not a turn toward melodrama. It is the slow erosion of a woman who has learned the danger of elegant lies. Eleanor has been a shield for a machine that promised to protect people. It protected itself. Her confession will not come on a stage. It will come first as a conversation, a yielding of an old script. She tells Jennifer what she remembers, the memo she signed reluctantly, the call from her son that asked her to manage a case, the envelopes that appeared for campaign donors. She hands over a small detail, a ledger page she found once in a locked drawer that lists shell company transactions. The pages smell of dust and old guilt. Jennifer listens in a way that does something to Eleanor's bones. Why now? Jennifer asks, small, because she also knows how important the answer will look in court. Eleanor breathes. He gave me $2 in the rain, she says. And for the first time, the sentence is not about politics or protection. It is about the sense that a small act made the world someone else's responsibility. She asks for immunity, or at least protection. The room is heavy with practicalities. Jennifer writes notes. Jennifer offers the kind of patience that only legitimacy can give. Back in a cell, Terrence meets Raymond in a way that passes information like a handshake. Raymond tells him the story about a man who was found sleeping behind a dumpster with shredded company memos sewn into his jacket. He tells him how sometimes the people at the top pay to make problems go away. Terrence nods. He carries that nod like a coin. Word simmers. The press circulates a photograph of a waitress with marked hands, bruises and bandages, but not the lurid picture a tabloid would sell. The story is of intimidation, not gore. Naomi becomes a name that people rally behind. Naomi's lawyer takes notes. The images of the hotel in the rain, of the framed photograph of Eleanor at a charity gala, of Terrence in a hoodie wiping a marble table, start to organize into a narrative in the public imagination, the kind of story that prefers villainy with clean lines. At his arraignment, Terrence sits quietly. The public defender explains possibilities in a voice that suggests the clock is a slow machinery. The judge takes the bench with a tired respect. The bail is set at a figure that feels like a small country to Terrence, high but not infinite. He waits. In the holding room, he is offered a cup of coffee that tastes like the holds of his life. He keeps his hands folded. He thinks of Gladys and Jazz. He thinks of the $2. Someone, whose name he will learn later, is working the other side of the ledger. Craig has been sitting in his car outside a courthouse for hours, phone keyed to a number he doesn't usually call. He is the one with a conscience that cuts him from wildlife into citizen. He is the person who will later move money in ways that are barely legal but deeply human. He sees a man in an orange jumpsuit through a frosted glass. He sees in him the face of someone who was not supposed to carry the brunt of accountability. Bail is posted in a bland, procedural way. The paperwork smells like paper and the coin of favors. Terrence walks out of the courthouse with the city arranged like a different country than the one that took him in. A man on the other side of the street lifts a hand and says something he thinks is charity. Terrence nods, because anything else would complicate the straight line he is trying to draw home. When he opens the front door of his apartment, Gladys is asleep at the table with a cup of tea long gone cold. A legal folder sits on the table where he left his appeal papers, but now another thing rests on top. A battery of documents bound with a rubber band, a business card he has never seen. On the card, in a tidy font, is a name, Jennifer Walsh. The rubber band smells faintly of office coffee. Underneath the rubber band is a photograph. Eleanor Ashford standing at a podium, a paper caught in her hand. Beside that photograph, a single scrap of paper. On it is a scribbled note. Start with Avalon. Terrence places the $2 she gave him in the palm of his hand and looks at it as if it might answer the rest of his days. He has been given a choice many people are never offered: to be small and futile, or to be an instrument for something that might be honest. He does what a man cannot help but do when given the chance. He calls his sister. Her voice is the same rationed warmth, and she laughs like she has a secret. "They tried to make you into a headline," she says. "You let them keep something else." He sets the file on the table and opens it carefully as if it might be fragile with consequence. The documents are not theatrical. They are spreadsheets, invoices with coded lines, a chain of corporate names that could confuse a jury and slow a newsroom. There is a photograph in the dossier, small and grainy, the same waitress Naomi, bandaged hand, a shadowy figure in the background. There is also a line in an email forward, "Handle before public disclosure." The words are efficient, like a surgeon who has become tired of apologizing. A message slides in from a number he does not know. It is one line: "Can we meet? Craig." He folds the papers, tucks the $2 under the ledger, and dresses for the rain. The city is a gray soup. He remembers the bus stop and the way the rain changed a night into a memory. Outside, someone watches from a car with windows that do not fog. The scene feels cinematic and small at once. A door opens. The crescent of headlights curves into a lot. Grace's hand trembles in a way that she is real and not a photograph. Eleanor has not yet gone to the press. Jennifer has not yet moved the chess pieces that will topple marble towers. Richard is still sleeping in rooms that are soundproofed, but the air thickens like thunder. They meet at a diner that has glass that fogs with the breath of strangers. Grace sits on a stool with her coat still buttoned. Craig sits with a tie loosely undone, the sign of a man who has sat up too late writing transfer memos to cover shame. They hand Terrence a USB with more files, and a worn photograph of a ledger that references hot oil only as one line in a page of discretionary payments. They apologize in words that taste like metal. "We can't promise protection," Craig says, and Terrence hears the human honesty. "But we can promise documentation. We can get you to people who read documents." "And if they don't listen?" Terrence asks. "Then we make them listen," Grace says, and the firmness of her voice has an echo of the woman on the curb who took $2 and vanished into the architecture of the city. Grace's eyes are hollow with exhaustion. She says, "My grandmother kept the money. She never said why." "She said nothing," Craig says, "until now." They walk him through files. There are invoices that show health services billed twice, pulsed claims that disappear, patient transfers that read like bookkeeping mistakes but are patterns if one lines them up. There is a name that repeats, Meridian Supply Chain, and a set of entries that suggest a vendor that does not exist. There are also internal emails with subject lines like contain and disposition. Jonathan Ashford is on vacation. Richard is unreachable. Everything feels like evidence, and everything feels like risk. They press something cheap into his hand, a small laminated card with the address of a church basement where a legal aid group meets. They tell him to be careful. They tell him to tell no one. He goes home with the dossier and tapes the $2 to the edge of an envelope with a note, "Given in the rain." He sleeps in a way that feels like a man who has set a fuse. He dreams of the hospital's long corridors and the faces of people he once trusted. In the morning, there is a headline that frames all of them in a language that makes for easy outrage. "Billionaire's wife's scandal deepens as whistleblower faces charges." The words are a net that people can throw their hands into and come out satisfied. But for Terrence, the story is narrower. How does the one life he has kept from breaking become a thing that can change many lives? He goes back to work with a dossier hidden behind his mop bucket. He cleans the same marble that will later host press conferences. He mindfully avoids the hotel ballroom where gift bags and speeches will be given. The world will not yet accept the idea that a janitor could be the hinge upon which a whole family's truth turns. Then, one evening, a black car pulls up at the curb, and there is a woman inside who watches him like one person watches another before they are willing to be accounted for. She lowers the window and slides across an envelope. The paper bears the faint impression of a pen, an amount and a sliver of writing. For counsel, E.A. Terrence understands in that tilt of a hand that whatever has begun is bigger than him. He looks at the envelope in the dim and remembers the $2 in his pocket, the woman on the bus stop, the hot oil story that was never meant to be a headline. He thinks of Jazz and the smell of boiled cabbage at the kitchen table. He tucks the envelope into the same drawer where he keeps letters from his sister and the folded photograph of Gladys and him. Outside, the rain begins again, precise as a metronome. The city shifts its gait like someone taking a step toward another country. He stands on the threshold of a decision and hears his sister's last voice. "You started this," she says. "Don't let them finish it without you." He goes down to the bus stop because the bus runs through that route, and there is a man giving away coffee to strangers. He watches the small theater of the street. A woman in a hood passes without seeing him. He reaches into his pocket and takes the $2 he has folded and places them back inside the same pocket. He cannot give them away yet. They are not yet his to give. At the intersection of fear and duty, a day lifts like a curtain. He has been arrested, framed, and freed on bail. He has files in his hand with names that could bring machines to their knees. He has a stranger inside a dress who gave him a cup of hot coffee in a back alley. He has a federal prosecutor who listened to a woman formerly above reproach and kept a file on a desk. Terrence sits at his kitchen table with a cup that tastes faintly of the diner and runs his thumb over the edge of a paper where the word Avalon sits like a small fossil. He thinks of the man he was and the man he could be. He remembers the $2 and how they folded into his day. He knows that what is owed is not vengeance but restitution. He keeps the $2 because some currencies, like kindness, trade slowly. Outside, a van with a Meridian logo turns a corner and moves toward the city. Inside, someone has a list. Inside another room, someone else opens a file and deletes an email. The city breathes and prepares itself for the day it must answer for what it has done to the vulnerable and what it has allowed the powerful to keep. At the corner, a woman shivers because her coat is thin and the rain is coming back. Terrence slips on his jacket and walks toward her without a plan, other than the impulse that made him bend over the curb months ago. He reaches into his pocket, and before he can think about the evidence, the lawyers, the cameras, he places the $2 in her hand. "Take it," he says. "Get out of the rain." She looks at the bills like they are a secret, and when she smiles, the city seems momentarily less sour. Terrence walks away because the world asks him to be more than a headline. Somewhere, a file moves across a desk. Jeffers, an associate, sends a note to a colleague. He writes, "We might have a problem." The problem is not only legal. It is a story waiting for the right set of hands to tell it honestly. The dossier sits on his counter like a promise, and in the next hour, a phone will buzz with a message he has been waiting for. A name flashes on the screen, J. Walsh. He takes a breath, and the rain becomes a drum roll in his head. He answers. "Terrence," a voice says, flat and steady. "We have more than you know. Are you ready?" "Terrence," Jennifer said, voice even, like someone who had read every implication before the sentence was finished. "We are ready. But we need more than anger. We need proof we can put in front of a grand jury." He slid the dossier closer to the phone and thought of the sticky way rain gathered at the curb. "We already have proof," he said. "It's just scattered." "Then let's gather it," she replied. "We have an agent on the case. He wants to meet you this afternoon. Be careful." They arranged the place, a community legal clinic behind a church, linoleum that squeaked in one corner, a row of folding chairs, and a curtained window that let in rain like a slow film. Terrence arrived with the dossier tucked under his arm and $2 folded into the booklet as if the notes could anchor him to consequence. Agent Marcus Hale waited in the back. He had the look of someone who could sit in a room for a long time and not need to talk, a field agent who trusted process. He had gray at his temples and a file folder with bright tabs. Jennifer introduced them as if she were placing chess pieces on a board. The prosecutor, the witness, the agent who would run the next moves. Marcus asked fewer questions and requested details in precise sentences. He wanted server logs, timestamps, payroll records, chain of custody for the flash drive. He wanted to know who had the most to lose and who had the least to gain from an internal leak. He smiled once, a small concession to the mechanics of the work. "We move with subpoenas, search warrants, and sealed indictments. We don't do theater, we do paper, and we follow paper until it leads us somewhere the inventors of shell companies forgot to clean." That was justice as choreography, tedious, careful, exact, and it suited Terrence, who had once kept careful notes on patient charts until his world had folded around one small insistence. The team began to unspool the filaments. Bank transfers to Avalon Trust, contracts with Meridian Supply Chain, invoices for security that had no service attached. Marcus made calls for forensic analysis on the USB Terrence had found. A technician was able to recover metadata that revealed the drive's contents had been copied at a courthouse kiosk's IP address on a date that coincided with an Ashford family fundraiser. It was the kind of breadcrumb that meant someone inside a protected orbit had reached across an institutional firewall.
Craig Ashford was the next fragile, luminous hinge. Jennifer asked Marcus to handle him with discretion. They could see Craig's hesitation as an asset. He could move money, yes, but he could also create a paper trail that no one in his family had intended to leave. Craig was rendered cinematically ordinary in the preliminary interviews, a man who drank too much coffee to steady his own conscience. In a packed room under a buzzing fluorescent light, he admitted, haltingly, that he had signed transfers on behalf of Avalon Trust when his father told him, "This is how we handle negative press." The phrase, so small and corporate, opened a museum of motives. Craig handed over copies of transfer confirmations and a ledger page he had photocopied with shaking fingers. He had been scared of being cut off, but the weight of names like Naomi and Jasmine carved the guilt cleanly. Grace's testimony was thornier. She had been the frightened young woman who left a note in Terrence's glove and then fled into ballrooms where cameras loved the untroubled pose.
In private, she had been keeping a separate paper life. Snippets of conversations in the family car, shorthand notes from overheard meetings, a lanyard from a security vendor that read like a brand she couldn't forget. She knew the men who had answered calls with muscle rather than questions. She had seen the van Naomi remembered. Grace agreed to give a sworn statement to a grand jury if she could be guaranteed a pipeline to safety and a path off the family payroll that wouldn't leave her homeless. Jennifer negotiated on those lines: immunity for testimony, a plan for relocation and identity change. Justice needed people who could tell what they'd seen. People needed assurances that telling would not end them. Eleanor's decision to come forward was the axis of risk. Once a judge whose signature could tilt case law, now a patron of causes, her voice carried weight and objection in equal measure. She had written a letter to the department. The kernel of confession contained sealed details about meetings where she had managed outcomes, and an admission that certain rulings had been tempered by off-the-books pressures. Jennifer had prepared an immunity agreement, full cooperation in exchange for procedural leniency, with the understanding that she would still be liable to public censure and to possible contempt for acts she had taken from the bench. Eleanor wrestled with the possibility of criminal exposure and with the idea of public humiliation. She walked past the chandeliers she had once loved and felt them as surveillance devices rather than ornaments. The plan took shape like a map. Jennifer and Marcus would present the predicate to a grand jury, a series of documented financial irregularities, staff testimony suggesting intimidation, emails with barren subject lines like containment and dispose, and medical records showing suspicious transfers for patients whose files had been shuffled. They gathered Naomi's medical reports, not for spectacle but to show pattern, the treatment she required, the hospital billings that had been labeled differently when Meridian processed the claim. They secured CCTV footage, a distant grainy frame of a van at the right time, a security guard with a label that matched a vendor invoice. They traced phone pings. The call logs placed certain numbers in proximity to the hotel on nights when staff reported irregularities. The more they collected, the more the Ashford machine revealed its seams. It was not a single gargantuan act. It was a lattice. Meridian contracts here, an off-the-books security group there, payments routed through Avalon Trust into legal defense funds, executives who treated mistakes as cost centers. The story that had been marketed in glossy brochures and donor newsletters was a construction maintained by buying silence, shifting paperwork, and the occasional brute act of intimidation. For months, the work hummed on. Subpoenas filed to banks, search warrants executed at a storage unit where a vendor kept crates of paperwork, forensics specialists extracting emails that had been thought deleted. Jennifer and Marcus watched as corporate counsel tried to stall with procedural motions. They watched as hired PR firms drafted statements that would later be quoted on morning shows. They moved slower than the spin and faster than the lawyers who preferred hearings to evidence. They compiled a sealed indictment and selected a panel of witnesses, a careful choreography that would leave them room to unseal certain charges at strategic moments. Terrence learned to hold his breath differently.
He went to the visits, to the legal aid meetings, to the small ceremonies in basements where volunteers stapled together packets. He told Jazz everything he could without compromising the team. Jazz listened with the acuity of someone once denied air and now given a script. "You keep that ledger," she said in a voice rippling with old courage and new hope. "You keep it like it's a baby." The press could not resist the angles. Billionaire's wife's scandal became a clickable banner. Tabloids wrote turns of phrase meant to sting. Cable shows promised on-air breakdowns. Commentary gushed like summer rain. Jennifer's team ignored the chatter. They let the press make noise while they gathered documents bed by bed, server by server. They had learned to respect how noise could be a weapon to distract public attention from methodical work. What drew the public's ire and put heat under already cooling anxieties was Naomi's humanity. Videos of her speaking to a local reporter were candid and measured. She refused to be an object of pity. She insisted she was a witness who had been harmed and would speak of it on her terms. She recounted finding oil on her uniform and the fact that security had been reluctant to take a statement until she had sought care at an outside clinic. Her attorney obtained a restraining order and asked for an independent medical review. Naomi's story became a lens. A waitress who had been injured for not keeping quiet. A person whose life interrupted the tidy public narrative. Behind the scenes, the Ashfords conferred and tightened. Richard Ashford moved through crises as if they were market corrections, predictable and reshapable. When he learned Eleanor had approached Jennifer, he scrambled to assemble a defensive perimeter. He would not be the first scion to try to buy silence. He was quite practiced at making problems into contracts. He offered payments to anyone who would sign statements, threatened to remove people from payrolls, and used influence to suggest that outsiders were making baseless accusations. Yet the files they had not imagined leaving, Craig's photocopies, a ledger page Eleanor could no longer hide, the metadata on the USB, baked a ledger of exposure none of the PR firms could scrub.
Then, in the quiet before the storm, someone tried to make Terrence look like the author of the protest. A second drive, similar to the one found in his locker, surfaced in a public place near the hotel and was traced, temporarily by a careful forensic lab, to an IP that had accessed the Ashford server. The defense, in a preliminary hearing, pointed to that digital trace and began to claim that Terrence had legally obtained access, had been angry for his lost career, and had sought to puncture the Ashford name for petty revenge. Media narratives leaned in. Terrence felt the old, familiar drag of being made into a story. It was a test of the team's patience. Jennifer called in a favor from a cyber specialist who had once worked for a tech firm and had a low tolerance for corporate obscurantism. He dug deeper, ran packet captures, and found a timestamp anomaly, a server time in one location that had been altered post facto, and a masked proxy behind a corporate subnet used by a vendor on Meridian's payroll. It was the sort of small, stubborn trace that suggested a setup. They could show, in controlled steps, that someone with access to Meridian's network could have planted the evidence to make Terrence look culpable. The case that had been made against him in the eyes of some could be unmade in front of others. Their breakthrough came when Eleanor handed over a sealed envelope she'd kept for months. Pages from a family ledger, an email thread where a name that matched a security vendor appeared beside a line reading, "Handle internally," and a short memo in her handwriting about preferred outcomes. Jennifer read all of it with a dryness that suggested she tried to keep her own feelings separate. She and Marcus realized they had enough to present to a grand jury. The evidence for a RICO-style pattern of racketeering, the enterprise, the predicate acts, fraud, wire transfers, and a list of victims. Sealed indictments were drafted in the department's slow, deliberate rooms. Jennifer wrote and rewrote. Marcus collected the last files. The team coordinated with state prosecutors where necessary. When the day came to present their case to the grand jury, the room was a study in old federal gravity. Mics, a court reporter, and the hush of people who knew that what they were about to do could tilt lives. They laid out the ledger, the vendor invoices, the emails, and the medical documentation in a way that aimed at pattern rather than theatrics. The grand jurors, several of whom had come from ordinary jobs, listened and asked practical questions. "How did these transfers show up in bank statements?" one juror asked. "What does 'contain' mean in a corporate email?" another inquired. Grand jurors are trained to ask, "Is there probable cause?" When their questions finished, the clerk read the names being considered for indictment. They voted to bring several people to answer for a pattern of fraud and racketeering.
The indictment was filed under seal so that the arrests could be coordinated. On the day the indictments were unsealed, the press was already awake. Cameras stacked like birds on wires outside federal courthouses. Jennifer and Marcus had planned the arrests carefully, a coordinated operation that would prevent flight and limit the damage of escape. Marshals were briefed, the FBI took lead on certain arrests, and state authorities offered support. For theater's sake, trusts and shell companies had their own representatives who would later issue statements bemoaning process. For impact's sake, a man named Richard Ashford was brought out in handcuffs under the glare of a courthouse camera. He looked smaller than the magazine covers would have suggested. The suit sagged like a stage costume that had been removed from its context. No one was taken by surprise. Well, not everyone. Eleanor sat in the back of the courtroom with a small folder in her lap. She had negotiated an immunity agreement that covered her testimony, but not the public consequences. Her face had a maritime look, calm but weathered. She had decided she could no longer calibrate silence as a virtue. The day the first indictments were served, the defense lawyers for the Ashford enterprise tried to spin. "These are political prosecutions," their lead counsel said to the press. "They are the work of people who do not understand the complexity of family philanthropy." The public protested in pixels and editorial pages. But a pattern had been built that could withstand spin. The FBI and prosecutors had amassed bank records, vendor contracts, and a line of witnesses willing to say what they had seen. The trial that followed was long by design. Prosecutors wanted to be thorough, defense lawyers wanted holes, the public wanted resolution. The first few days moved slowly, the way a city warms when snow begins to melt. Jennifer opened with a calm speech that framed the prosecution in human terms, not as a crusade against wealth, but as a pursuit of truth for those whose lives had been affected: workers, patients, the injured waitress who had been ushered out of the hospital without answers. She spoke of stewardship gone wrong, of charitable fronts used to protect a private machine. The jury listened. Defense strategy was to isolate, to personalize the story, and to make the prosecution look like opportunists. They sought to discredit witnesses like Naomi, to portray Craig as a disgruntled employee, and Terrence as a man who resented the loss of his career. For a moment, the trial looked like it might hinge on swaying sympathy. Then Jennifer rested her case with a slow, intended pressure. She called Eleanor. Eleanor took the stand not as a polished holiday portrait, but as a woman whose life had become an account ledger of small admissions. She told the jury, in her measured way, how she had once believed in the narrative she had been asked to curate, how corporate counsel had presented her options with a legal vocabulary that promised reputational safety, how her son had called with an urgent voice, and how, in a string of compromises, she had allowed the scales to tip. She admitted to signing memos that managed legal exposures. She read, word by exacted word, emails she had once thought she could destroy with a memory. The courtroom leaned in. When the time came to discuss Jazz, Eleanor's hands trembled. She read the name of the defense firm that had paid for a witness's testimony in Jazz's trial. She spoke of a ledger line that referred to legal placements. It was not melodrama. It was the kind of confession built from bureaucratic nouns and human consequence. She told the jury, haltingly, that the man who had given her $2 in the rain had shifted her thinking. She had kept that memory because it reminded her there were people she could not set aside. It was a sentence so simple it made reporters fumble for adjectives. Outside the courtroom, the cameras buzzed like an insect swarm.
On social media, the phrase "billionaire's wife scandal" was a trending tag that collected outrage and empathy in equal measure. That attention had an effect. It made other witnesses come forward. Employees previously willing to remain anonymous sought the protection of subpoenas. Whistleblowers contacted Jennifer asking for a path to tell what they'd seen without losing everything. It was during Eleanor's testimony that the federal team moved. Unsealing an arrest warrant in the middle of a hearing is rare, but coordinated enforcement had prepared for a moment where the evidence and the courtroom narrative coincided. Prosecutors presented the jury with the mosaic of documents while marshals stood ready in outer halls. Richard Ashford was arrested not as revenge, but as the execution of a sealed indictment that had been based on the mosaic of bank records, corporate invoices, and witness statements. Marcus and his team had built a factual scaffolding that allowed agents to execute those warrants without the risk of blowing their case. The courtroom action was exacting. Richard's lawyers suggested ambush. Journalists misread the choreography as a performance. But it was legal procedure: sealed indictment, coordinated execution, arrest following the unsealing once probable cause had been established. The cameras caught it, and the image of a man in handcuffs made for a powerful juxtaposition to the glossy photos that hung in donor portfolios. Terrence sat in the gallery during the courtroom storm. He watched people he had once passed in hospital corridors, the private nurses, the vendors, take the stand and tell the truth with a bluntness that suggested they had reached a limit.
When the judge announced that certain charges against Terrence were being reassessed in light of new evidence that pointed to a planted data trail, Terrence felt something like the air changing in his lungs. The prosecution moved to dismiss the charges after presenting the defense with a well-documented case showing the planted nature of the flash drive and the proxy that had been used to plant the files. There was, as Jennifer had insisted, no theater. There was evidence admitted, objections heard, and documents presented so that a jury could see pattern rather than allegation. Eleanor's testimony was devastating but probative. Craig and Grace's cooperation made the prosecution airtight on matters of financial trail and motive. Naomi testified with a steady voice. She described how she had been discouraged from speaking and how hospital staff had cabled concerns in quiet emails that were now entered into evidence. The jury saw the ledger lines. They watched bank transfers. They read internal emails in which words like disposition and handle were used not as euphemisms but as directives. When the jury returned with verdicts on several counts, guilty on racketeering and several charges of healthcare fraud for key executives, not guilty on certain lesser counts for others, it felt like a public accounting. The legal process had run its course, and the result included both criminal sentences and the unglamorous work of civil remediation, orders to reimburse patients, settlements to compensate victims, and directives to dissolve shell entities that had been used to move money. Meridian faced a civil suit and subsequent federal receivership. A judge would later appoint an independent monitor to oversee the corporation's wind-down and to ensure funds flowed to victims. Jasmine's release was one of the quieter miracles. The defense team for the Ashfords had relied in part on the narrative that the actions of people in the family had no direct tie to her conviction, but Eleanor's ledger and the ledger pages Craig provided showed exactly how witness payments and legal defense funds had been allocated, and the Attorney General's office moved quickly to vacate certain testimonies that had clearly been bought. A motion for a new hearing was filed. With the damage to the integrity of prior testimony publicly evident, the judge overseeing Jazz's case granted relief. The state dismissed the charges in the face of undermined evidence and presented new grounds to clear her name. When the prison gates opened and Jazz walked out into the yard, the rain began to fall in a way that felt like a benediction rather than a burden. She ran to the car where Terrence waited with Gladys in the back, eyes wide and bright in the half-forgetful way dementia lets be present sometimes. They embraced in a small private parking lot while strangers in a gray drizzle looked on. Cameras tried to capture the image for tomorrow's paper, but the scene belonged to the family, messy, forgiven, and deeply human. There were cost points to this reckoning.
Eleanor faced consequences for judicial improprieties. The DOJ offered her a negotiated agreement. Her cooperation reduced the gravity of her exposure, but she accepted the idea of stepping back from public life and of being part of a broader remedial program to restore trust in institutions she had once chaired. It was not impunity. It was a legal bargaining of culpability and cooperation. The world would write many columns about it. The fall of a patron, the moral arithmetic of confession, the calculus of punishment in the face of cooperation. Terrence, for his part, was reinstated as a paramedic after a long administrative review. The department he had once served recognized that procedural reviews had been internally flawed and that the revocation of his certification had been, in part, a consequence of a campaign that sought to protect reputations by removing inconvenient witnesses. There were meetings, hearings, and finally signatures on papers that put a uniform back on him. His recertification came with a quiet ceremony at a station house. An older manager clasped his shoulder and said, "It's good to have you back." His new jacket fit differently. The fabric smelled like something that could carry him into rooms again. Restitution funds were allocated from the proceeds of civil suits and federal penalties. Naomi received medical support and a modest settlement for her damages, along with help relocating and finding a job that did not rely on her returning to an environment that had once endangered her. The cases that Meridian had settled included payments to families of patients whose care had been deprioritized for profit. Tragic miscalculations that became the basis for a public conversation about healthcare integrity. Legislators introduced bills in the wake of the scandal requiring greater transparency in vendor contracting and third-party security hires. The Ashford Empire's tower closed, in stages. Nonprofits cut ties, corporate boards dissolved committees, and the philanthropic accounts once used to polish a public image were audited and, in some cases, suspended. There were, predictably, other legal spurs: civil suits from families, additional subpoenas, and a long procession of depositions for people who had once thought their work invisible. The story changed the texture of public philanthropy in the city. Donors became more cautious, and nonprofit boards demanded more transparency. For Terrence, the most human rewards were not legal victories, but the return of small rituals. He returned to the station as a paramedic and sat in a lunchroom that smelled of coffee in a new way. He answered the call that came with boredom and with the sudden cruelty of someone who needed a hand.
Gladys moved into a day program that gave her structure and a morning where the staff could help her remember names. Jasmine slept in the house again and repaired what she could of a life paused too long. Craig and Grace walked away from family money and into a quieter life, doing what reparation required: testimony, assistance to the wounded, and, in Craig's case, public statements about his complicity and his will to repair. In a small, intentionally framed moment, Terrence stood in front of a modest crowd in a community center where local charities had assembled to talk about worker protections. Jennifer and Marcus sat in the third row like two people who prefer the work to the applause. Naomi spoke. Her voice had a steady cadence that suggested the thing she'd most wanted was the truth. Jazz read a short statement about the danger of purchased testimony. Craig, who had cooperated, offered apology that sounded raw but sincere. Eleanor, now rare in public, donated to a fund dedicated to supporting whistleblowers, a small irony and an attempt at practical restitution. The public was ready for a motif. Someone framed a cheap photograph of a $2 bill in a threadbare gallery of protest memorabilia. Terrence had the one she'd given him back. After the trial, someone, Grace, had returned the bill encased in plastic with the words "Given in the Rain" written on a backing card. In court, those small things sometimes help juries connect numbers to names. When the jury finally returned a verdict that included the exoneration language that cleared Terrence of the charges, there was a frame of that $2 in a prosecutor's file that felt like a talisman. The final moves required reconciliation and the messy work of restoring dignity. The city passed a municipal ordinance that tightened contracts between hospitals and third-party vendors.
Meridian's receivership required hiring an outside firm to distribute funds to affected families. Individual employees who had been coerced into silence received counseling and legal aid. The Band-Aid solutions were not adequate for all injuries. Some families would take years to find closure. But a legal scaffolding for accountability had been erected. In the months after, Terrence found himself standing under a streetlight, the rain a fine tape at his shoulders. The city felt like a fabric repaired with new thread. He had not intended to be a symbol. He had only intended to keep one life afloat, his sister's, his mother's, his own. But symbols find people, and he had become one, whether he wanted it or not. He stood by a curb and watched a woman in a thin coat hunch from the wind. Her shoes were cheap, and her hands shook with the kind of precise fear that had once made him give away his last dollars.
He reached into his pocket, and his fingers closed on the $2 bill that had been returned to him. Soft from being handled, a crease that had been made by someone who knew what it meant to give what they had. He folded the bill and pressed it into the woman's hand. "Keep it," he said. "Get somewhere warm." She looked at the bills as if they were a secret she had been given permission to hold. She smiled, and it was both small and enormous in the rain. He walked away with the feeling that needed no grander accounting. The act was its own ledger. At the station's locker room, he pinned back his hair, zipped his jacket, and felt the weight of new responsibility. He had been reinstated not as a trophy, but as a worker needed somewhere. The city would call him to the things he had once done with the same hands he had used for giving. That night, he answered a call about a person who had collapsed in a bus shelter. He wrapped a blanket around them, checked vitals, and carried on. The life he had chosen was not resolved in a courtroom. It was lived in small tasks: warmed hands, steady breaths, returned calls. Jennifer moved on to other cases, leaving a slow trail of policy proposals and testimonies in legislative halls. Marcus, quiet as ever, went back to the field, ready for the next pattern of malfeasance. Naomi became an advocate for workers in service industries. Grace enrolled in a program that trained people in nonprofit governance. Craig took a job in a small firm dedicated to ethical contracting and spent the rest of his life trying to make amends through work rather than silence. The Ashford name diminished in donor lists, and their public clout waned. The reporters who had once chased glossy stories wrote columns about institutional failure rather than about individual villainy. The city, in its halting, human way, moved forward. Years later, Terrence would find the $2 bill in the back of a Bible someone had given him as a housewarming present. Maybe a gift after Jasmine's housewarming party. Maybe something his mother had kept on a shelf. The bill was worn but whole. He would slip it into his wallet and keep it as a reminder that small acts have consequences. That kindness is not a currency of convenience, but a tool for repair. He would sometimes fold it and press it into the hands of people who needed a brief pause in a chaotic day. On his first shift after reinstatement, he pulled up to a scene where an elderly man had fallen in the rain. Terrence lifted him gently, spoke to him simply, and gave his hand steady warmth. The man looked up and said, "You saved me." Terrence smiled, thinking of courtrooms, indictments, and the slow work of law. Some saviors carry weighty titles, some simply show up with steady hands and a blanket. At the end, when the city had settled into a long, uneasy peace, there was a small, public string of reforms that could be traced to the case.
New reporting channels for hospital workers were established. Municipal contracts required transparency. A fund was set up to support people who came forward. The ripple effects were not perfect, they never are, but they changed the arc of a few lives. And on an ordinary evening, when the rain came down the way it often did in that city, soft, patient, and washing at neon lights, Terrence walked past a bus stop. He saw a woman with a coat that had seen better days. He reached into his pocket, gave her $2, and told her to get inside someplace warm. She smiled as if he had given her something that mattered. He walked away with his hands in his pockets and the knowledge that justice, like kindness, is a long, unruly work. If this story moved you, share one small act of kindness that changed your life.